So I'm so happy this evening to introduce Christopher Lee Manus, a poet, scholar, and educator whose work has appeared in Louisiana History, the Southwestern Review, and Carville, Remembering Leprosy in America. He lives in Dallas, Texas, and we are celebrating tonight his book of poetry, Naming the Leper. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. Chris, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and take it away.
Thanks everyone for joining, and I do want to thank Napa Bookmine and Elena and the staff for hosting this tonight. So thank you very much. And so my book is Naming the Leper, and what I will do is I will read 2 or 3 poems at a time, and then I'll just stop every now and then and talk about either that group of poems or the process for writing them. These poems are documentary poetry, and so how most of them were created was by using documents from my family's archives that are housed at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. I had 5 family members, my great-grandfather, Edmond, and his 4 siblings, all of whom were diagnosed with what was then called leprosy. And at separate times, they were all admitted to the leprosarium in Louisiana. While in that leprosarium, they wrote to relatives and doctors and people on the outside. And we have about 200 plus letters, mostly written by my great-grandfather and my uncle Norbert during their time at the leprosarium. All 5 of my relatives died at Carville. They died in the leprosarium. And so these letters are really all that we have of them. And so tonight you will be reading the makeup of that. The first 3 poems that I will read are actually inspired more by some of the folklore around the leprosarium. So Carville was established as a leprosarium, but people in the city of Carville actually did not know that it was a leprosarium. And so for some years, at least in the 1890s, it was propagated that it was an ostrich farm. And then there were all of these myths about how one could get leprosy. You might get it from breastfeeding, you might get it from fish, you might get it from cattle, you might get it from different things, none of which were exactly ever scientific, but nonetheless, these were all stories that were told. And so these first 3 poems are a little bit about the folklore, and then they also give you some insight into the public policies that were established at the leprosarium. So, tall tales grow limbs, my mother said. In the beginning, the word lived among us, an American mindset, public health policy, and finally flesh. But I was nursing, she said, when it first learned to hiss and moved down transoms over my crib. Adapted to syllables, it had breath and could rattle the underbelly of particulars from cattle milk which we sipped. No, that can't be it. It must have come from the fish, become the word Turville choked on when he swallowed the fish bone that split his esophagus. At the same time, Carville was said to breed ostriches, and the word took on feathers before anyone corrected it. In the name of my kin, I listened, changed skins, and grew stilts to reach the height of the tallest tree where their spirits nested, and the word dwelt in the wind. The Book of Names. These are the children of Terville and Lucy Landry by order of birth. Edmond, Norbert, Charlie, Marie, Albert, and Amelie. This is the order they died. Charlie, Norbert, Edmond, Amelie, Marie, and Albert. These are the children of Edmond and Claire, Leonide and Wilbert. This is the order they died, Wilbert and Leonide. These are the names of the women who told my mother the family stories: Sadie Morgan Spencer and Zenobia Raisley. These are the last names of doctors who participated in Norbert, Edmond, Amelie, Marie, and Albert's incarcerations: Mouton, Sabatier, Johns, Denny, Mingus, and Johansson. These are the names of the 1917 Surgeon General and Secretary of Treasury Rupert Blue and William Gibbs McAdoo, who carried out Public Law 64-299. These are the names Norbert, Edmond, and Amelie chose in confinement: James Jackson, Gabe Michael, and Emma Lee Michael. This is the place Norbert, Edmond, Amelie, Marie, and Albert were forced to live and to die. United States Marine Hospital, number 66, otherwise known as Carville. Public law. These were the procedures concerning leprosy, eruptions, and ostrich forms in 1917. When a diagnosis was suspected, in accordance with paragraph 32.86, the patient in question could not be in contact with people on the street and in the stores. And if the diagnosis was confirmed, a patient had to volunteer admittance to Carville. The way ostrich feathers are clipped begins at 6 months old, when the bird is as tall as its parents, has a curved neck, small head, humped back, paddle toes, and an ungainly walk. From that time forth, every 6 months, the feathers are clipped and sold. At 8 feet tall, an ostrich's single leap covers 25 feet. Public health employees at Carville earned additional pay for working with lepers, though by 1906, the medical community believed it to be the least contagious of all diseases. These were the patients never compelled to live under armed guard, without the right to vote, to marry, or to live where they might, those with smallpox and tuberculosis. When my great-grandfather Edmond entered Carville, it was 1924, and he entered the year his brother, Norbert, died in Carville. So they were actually not there at the same time. Norbert died earlier in the year, I think in February, and my great-grandfather enters it that fall. So he understood, unlike my uncle Norbert, who thought he would be admitted to this hospital and would live and would be cured and he'd be able to return home. My great-grandfather understood he was there to die. And so his letters sometimes are a little bit more solemn, a little bit more realistic, but he was always trying to keep up hope because my grandmother, his daughter, and his son, he knew would be reading the letters. And so he tends to try to find things to talk about that maybe if they happen to see the letter or read the letter that would not upset them. But he wrote private letters to his mother, He attempted to write to my great-grandmother, and those letters were far more serious about what the conditions were. So these two poems are about the children at Carville and my great-grandfather and a woman began a school at Carville so that they could have other things to do than think of their sickness. All of these children were also in the hospital with leprosy. So Edmond, writing under his Carville name, gave Michael in 1925. Under my lead, House 31 operates with military precision. Kids rise no later than 6:30, dine 3 times daily, take oil or medications as ordered, bathe without cursing or vulgarity, are not permitted to smoke or gamble, and write home monthly. Not that anyone on the outside writes back. I love you must be taught in schools and shown in picture shows. More satisfying and oftentimes quicker to watch trees green after winter than bear the burden of a blank page and let its whiteness define time. There is really so little to tell. The other teacher and I have to make the whole day up, but we never complain in front of the kids. Instead, we amuse ourselves with seeing the sky through their eyes. The children's letters from House 31. An elephant on the roof each morning. I am just getting started and hope is good. After 21,000 days in Carville, believe it or not, Mr. Ripley, a kitten mothering hens was the life of the party. Mama, do not believe them. They do not know I can be cured. If a cow can have 2 heads and be born at the station dairy, I take my bath treatments regularly and say the rosary every evening. Hope bends her head at my window and ties her shoes. On a Sunday afternoon, eating stone permits ostriches to grind roughage from the desert plants and hard objects they consume. Instead of bulls, we hunt birds and gather hyssops. Miss Roma says elephant soup will keep our memory strong and octopus tails will give us muscles. When we can't sleep, Mr. Gabe reminds us to breathe, count heartbeats, he says. Folks, your hello would be a brush of leaves over a hollering creek. On a dark night, it would be a raft of moonlight. We could fish dreams and cast away nightmares, remembering to breathe together. My great-grandfather wrote letters to his wife, or attempted to write letters to his wife. We know that she did respond to some because in letters to his mother, he says, you know, I got a letter from Claire the other day, or I finally heard from Claire after so many months. But for all what the documents tell us, when my great-grandfather entered Carville, really, he and my great-grandmother ceased to communicate in any meaningful way. My great-grandfather wanted to leave Carville. He had the money to have left and fled the United States. He could have lived wherever he wanted. So he wanted to leave with her and take the children, and she, for any number of reasons, refused. And so some of those letters are represented in my book. And so I'll read just a few next. Edmond writing to his wife, Claire. Where the ink should have spelled I love you, there are so many other ways to say I need you. Send money, pray for me, think of me, don't worry or trust. Even an I don't know can substitute for love. If you listen carefully enough, sound afraid of nothing can break fences, dodge bullets, and cross borders. Words dressed in ink can simulate a voice in lonely quiet or serve as garments from the cold, but your silence hurts. Perhaps I can understand the place you are in, the truth of it. 2 kids to raise on your own, and no proof this nightmare will wake. Perhaps I know the futility of lending words like they're bricks made without straw, fearful the ground will sink from under you or the walls you have built will crumble. I appreciate how light is made, from a bulb turned on and off without encumbrance, the same with love. If we make the effort, what is it that galaxies can travel billions of years and still jiggle particles in our eyes? Yet from you there is no saying, no letter, no word. After all these months, only indifference, not disease, but silence affects our marriage. And the fact is, our children hear it like a snake's rattle in the grass. These next letters are also from my great-grandfather's correspondences, and they are made up with my uncle's correspondences as well. But when read, they appear as if my great-grandfather is saying all of it, but individual lines come from some of the different letters. Dear folks, I don't know myself, and here they don't use names. On any given day, I can be called Cicero, Albert, or James Jackson. I wish you could see me. I've changed. I've grown a mustache and wear a derby, and I've tanned. It's all about getting in the dirt and sweating the sickness out. Every time I do, I feel like a new man. Claire, I don't expect you to understand. Here, I am human again, less a leper today than I've been. It is beautiful New Orleans, its legs knee-deep in the Mississippi, reflections distorted, with its strange personifications of humans spilled on the pavement. Dear folks, an old fellow we are watching die since Sunday has been talking out his head and having convulsions. That flies aren't enough, we are raising our hands in prayer, but pray as we must for mercy. I cannot ask the Lord to cure me. I am just trying to adjust to the dead of the place. Like Lazarus in his tomb before he could tell what he had seen, I am breathing too much in a cell that has rats, wide planked floors, and dreams spent on Leper cliffs, too much smelling pine. What is the price of the colors you sent? By the way, the old man died. Folks, I'll tell you what you will not find in newspapers. Clara Mertz was going blind and wanted to see her father for the last time. So she wrote and asked him to be on his front porch. She assured him she would not get down or even try to engage in conversation. She just wanted a memory of him. 2 days before she was to leave, she received a typed letter from her father's attorney, which read, "To whom it may concern, Mr. Mertz's daughter died 30 years ago." My great-grandfather was in Carville during the 1927 flood of the Mississippi River. And we have at least a couple of letters from that time. And he was extremely worried that authorities would flood the leprosarium. And later, the book actually mentioned in the introduction by Marcia Godet, she was a scholar, is a scholar, and she actually found some evidence that, you know, he might have actually been somewhat correct on his suspicion. The authorities did in fact have a safety plan for the hospital if it had flooded, but that plan did not include taking the patients. It included taking the hospital staff and the nurses, but exactly where the patients would have fit on these boats is somewhat debated. So anyway, so these letters come from that time, or these poems are inspired by that time. Dear folks, the river situation is worse. The levee has become indifferent, and I am afraid the rest of the world with it. Things are not good here. Carville is pregnant with a loneliness that startles me off of my seat sometimes. I've tried to scream, but nothing ever comes out except tears. There was a murder here last week. One patient killed another, and now with the levee to break, well, I don't think I can stand it. I will not be killed a leper. Oh, the nuns offer their blessings and tell me not to worry, but prayer replaces people here. Religion as a pastime, thought interrupts. What else would the saints do if they didn't have a sinner to forgive or a leper to cure? The nuns tell me to keep my faith, trust, but I don't know. Tell Claire the authorities have a boat in front of the big house for their use. When in Carville, my great-grandfather started the canteen that became very popular at the Leprosarium, and I think was there right up until the institution closed. And but my great-grandfather ran it, and initially what he would do is he would actually buy the goods himself and then sell it in the store, and most often just give it away. And so anyway, this poem is inspired by some of the documents that he wrote, but also one of the patients wrote as well about the canteen. Gabe Michael's Canteen. The Tammany Hall of Carville became the politics not to die in this place. The daily struggle not to look too far past its fence. Patients lived on in grief, blind and lame, while loved ones on the outside sealed their tombs. Before their time, patients opened their own graves, brushed its dust off their clothing, and took to dreaming themselves out of caskets loved ones made with the prettiest of flowers. By the time they actually died, they were masters at defeating death. Not once, but twice, and 70 times after that, every day they buried themselves in something to do, from tennis to golf, baseball to music, dances to dinners, school to talkies. There was already enough silence. Why watch it? When the rest of the United States divided things into white and colored, patients celebrated 35 drinking fountains, one for each cottage, electrically refrigerated and without the hassle of bailing water from a single hose. Diversity abounded so that even the cleaning crew was considered not for what they did, but who they were. They all mattered. At Carville, not always to doctors or nuns, and certainly not to outsiders, but to each other they could trace hands, see with eyes shut, and stock the shelves with candy bars, tobacco, and art. This next poem is actually in 3 parts, and it tells you a little bit about my great-grandfather's youngest brother, Albert, who was the last in my family to die in Carville. He had leprosy, but kept it quiet throughout the 1920s and 30s, basically while his siblings were in the leprosarium. And then when his sister, my great aunt Marie, was diagnosed with leprosy, she would have been taken to the leprosarium under armed guard and left alone in the institution. So my uncle basically admitted to the disease at that time, and he drove her to Carville. And so he remained there until her death. So that's part of the story that is in this poem. Lessons from a case study I give my students. 1, report of physicians ordered by the court, 1956. Maybe the choice wasn't Ed's. For the sake of his children, he might have felt he had to remain in hospital. And ignorance can be excused for Norbert. After all, he was the first Landry to enter Carville. Regarding his sister Amelie, modern surgical techniques removed enough of her face to warrant staying. When it comes to Marie, her status prior to expiration is enough to infer why she didn't leave. First, the loss of her vision. Second, she suffered from an unknown brain syndrome. Like her mother and her Aunt Pauline, Marie existed in a coma-like disposition. For some years, she either refused to or couldn't speak. One of the two, or maybe both. Immobility, a last defense of the brain. Maybe her frozen state was her way of not losing another thing or person. The case is different for Albert. He had the disease, but did not suffer from it. He only admitted to leprosy in 1941 when authorities diagnosed his sister, Marie. They would have taken her at gunpoint from the family farm, her only home. Instead, Albert drove her to the hospital. Norbert, Edmond, and Amelie each died alone, but Albert stayed until her death. That part can be explained. But after July 26, 1962, Marie's death, he chose to remain at the hospital. That part proves contentious. 2, February 13, 1956. At Carville, no one disputed that Albert came from old money. Indeed, after its slaves were freed, the family had diversified its interest in banking, law, agriculture, and the entrepreneurial spirit. As late as the mid-20th century, members still sold property to the highest bidder. For sport across Louisiana, cousins named streets after each other. To mark territories, lawyers, some cousins and others from even older money, finagled wills to disenfranchise some heirs and calculated strategies for paying federal taxes for others. In Carville, as well as outside it, family owned a bit of earth, a cottage on the old plantation. The hiccup to the family's financial growth came in 1956 when Aunt Adrienne died, leaving 1/10 of her interest to Marie. The estate proposed to subdivide some of the property for residential purposes, but the problem, the estate determined, was Marie. What if prospective purchasers inquired into the situation and rejected the title? Small town rumor could be dismissed, but this potentially made her location public record. Although there is no reason to consider that Albert or Marie countered the estate, in fact, such sales had guaranteed Marie financial security. It remains to be argued how she or Albert felt. If released, which relative would have let them in? Where would they have felt wanted? Who among the clan would have cared for them without pity? Possessions they could sign away, but without love, what were they? 3. August 10th, 1919. Aunt Adrienne's first letter is not to her nephew, Norbert. It is to a nun at Corville, to whom she addresses for advice. Tell me, she writes, is it safe for people to go visit the patients? And is there any danger to correspond with them? Aunt Adrienne's fear is understandable for the period. At least she asked questions rather than accept public policy. But that she needed to ask at all, that love as an action, a simple letter written, was not her instinct, may provide evidence for Uncle Albert's decision to remain at Corville from Marie's death in 1962 to his own in 1977. Edmond wrote to Claire sometimes in 1926 to tell her hotel takes anyone's money and not one's blood tests. He understood wealth could take him anywhere except home. We
Chris, we're at about 30 minutes.
A few minutes left, right?
Yep.
Yes, so I will read just one more poem. So I'll read two. This poem is in 3 parts, and it comes from both, 2 of the parts come from Norbert's letters just before he died. And then one of the stanzas comes from my great-grandfather, or at least they are, they use lines from those letters. Fragments from the papers of Norbert and Edmond Landry, September 11th, 1924. Mornings become a way of life, a calling back. I'm grinding my teeth each night and can't stop. The knowing afterwards, Norbert's doctor's notes, not leprosy, but pulmonary tuberculosis. Apparatus, married, no. Numerous discrete nodules on face and lobes, ulcers on thighs, unable to walk, acid fast stains, race, white. August 8th, 1919. Without proof, who will dream us awake? Have something at least belong to the truth of the place. Show the world my letter. When I write to one, it will count for all. Swollen are the days between writing a line and receiving a response. By the way, I am only half myself. Saturday morning, undated. The canned chicken made us sick. I can't keep even milk down. My feet and legs are engorged. I have a gland under my arm the size of a head. Everything in me wants out, and there's really no news except that. The last poem that I will read, my great-grandfather as I mentioned, was afraid in the 1927 flood that he would drown or that he would be allowed to drown. For whatever reason, while my great-grandmother did nothing to help him in 1927, when he died in 1932, she buried him in the ground. And for whatever reason, she feared the rest of her life that his grave was filled with water. She just had this fear that, certainly water was getting in there somehow. And so she had ordered before her death, she had ordered that his grave be exhumed and rebuilt so that water would not get into it. For whatever reason, in 2003, my grandmother out of the blue finally got the call saying they were ready to exhume his body and they would be fixing his grave. This, by the way, was 30 years after he had died. The fortunate thing is that I got to be there with it. And so this poem was written when I was with my grandmother at the grave. Remains. It was 2003 when Edmond's body was exhumed. To save him from the water, Claire worried, had his soul in unrest. Of course, his body was wet, not from water, but from death. Skin becomes paste. They opened his grave and 71 years brushed my face. His skull was hidden by a piece of wood so opaque that the timber resembled a shawl sunken into the haunt of his nose, mouth, eyes, lips. My grandmother Leonide and I watched as his casket fell apart, the word leper written on top of it. In the kitchen, we exhumed his body a second time, over smoke from tea with lemon. What Edmond knows, death, its brightness, shoveled in a garbage bag, silent. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
So we don't have any comments or questions in the chat box. So feel free if you want to ask a question or make a comment, just unmute yourself and go for it.
I have a question. Can y'all hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk about when you started to become aware of this history of your family. When you were a child, was it talked about, or was it just really stigmatized? And then when you started to think about putting this together as poetry and had access to the letters and things like that.
So I was told about it as a child. My mother would tell me stories when we would watch, shows like Papillon or Ben-Hur or any of those other very stereotyped shows that show quote unquote lepers in them. And my mother would say, your dad's family, your grandfather, your great-grandfather was a leper. And, she would tell me these stories. She had visited Carville when she dated my father. But to be very clear, my family never said anything about leprosy. No one in my family ever questioned why they were visiting relatives in a hospital. It was never asked why they were sick. It was never to be discussed. But my mother, if you know my mother, she does not give up with questions. So she would probe and she had the opportunity to ask my grandmother about her father. And so my grandmother shared, he was diagnosed with leprosy. It's painful to talk about. And so my mother knew bits and pieces. And so she would say what she knew and frankly embellished everything else. And so that piqued my interest. And then when I was in college, I had a history professor. My family had just kind of, the letters had resurfaced. They had been hidden in a closet and forgotten about for 20 years. And somewhere in that time, my cousin mentioned, oh, I came across those letters the other day. And so I had mentioned to a history professor that, hey, my family has these letters. I don't know what to do with them. And she's the one who said, you should really just sit with them. You should read them. You should try to know more about your family. And so it was really her probing that made me go back. And then I formally interviewed my grandmother several times. And she began to talk more openly. When her brother died, my grandmother began to speak about Corville because I think she realized that with her death, no one else was going to remember it. I mean, my cousins remember, again, going to a hospital that they never even questioned was a leprosarium, or they never questioned why they were there. So I think she knew that if she didn't speak, those stories would die. So she began to tell me more stories. Initially, the book, I wrote this as a master's thesis back in 2003, whenever that was. And then, I moved to Dallas. I really thought I had said everything I needed to say. And a friend of mine died a few years ago. And I started to, out of habit, wake up very early in the morning, but really in grief was not willing to really write anything new or, think and terribly creative. So someone said, why don't you reread your master's thesis? So I reread it and I hated every word. And so I realized that there were, things I thought I had put into the thesis were just not there. And I realized that I might have missed a few things. And so I spent several months just rereading the not so much the poems I had originally written, but rereading the letters and asking those questions about, how does this fit in with the medical records? When I was 18 years old or 20 years old when I wrote my master's thesis, and I completely ignored the medical records and the public health policies because, when you're 18, those things would be a little boring. So I completely ignored part of these primary documents, and then going back to it at almost the age that my great-grandfather was when he died. Suddenly I was reading these medical records and in some cases saying, wow, I wish my family had said that. That would have saved me a lot of money if they had said what was in our medical history. And so I began to reread these letters with far more just knowledge of the disease. And so then that is really what inspired the book. So
thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have a question or comment?
I have a question. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Kirk.
Hey, how are you? Hey, so what did you write a poem about your grandmother's reaction to what she witnessed at the grave when the body was exhumed?
So no, I did not. My grandmother was like her mother, and probably that generation. My grandmother could put a face that you could not break. She was not going to show any visible emotion. The closest my grandmother would ever come to emotion is her mouth would get very dry. And so she'd do this a lot, and she was nervous. So the only thing she did at the grave was a lot of this. There are poems in the book, though, that do, and they did come out of a series of interviews that I had done with her earlier. And she did discuss her grandmother, her mother, and her father in a little bit more real way. I think my grandmother was a little bit disturbed and mad with her mother in some cases by how she let her fear really stop them from seeing him. Laws at the time would have prevented them from exactly, touching and holding hands and everything, but they could have seen him. Had they gone to Carville, they could have stood on one side of the fence, him on the other. So she had a lot of undealt with anger with her mother. And so some of that is in the book, yes. But at the grave, all she could do was just, this.
Any other questions or comments? Go for it, yeah.
I was wondering if you had been thinking about like any parallels to isolation during the pandemic, because I've even seen some writings by people who were at Carville or in the hospital colonies in Brazil, who talk about having sort of PTSD and like remembering the time when they were forced to, and now they're having to stay home for a year or something like that. But have you thought about that, kind of any parallels to isolation today and stigma
Right.
of COVID? And
Yes, I have thought of that, mainly in that I can remember just the month before COVID, I can remember doing readings when the book came out. And, I would sometimes preface this by saying, it's difficult to imagine isolation, to be completely quarantined from your loved ones. And of course, now I don't even have to make that statement. And so, yes, I think there are parallels. I think there are differences, and those certainly deserve to be said and mentioned. But I think the basic emotion and loneliness, and if I just use my family, they're prone to depression that we see in their letters. I mean, that they made very clear in their letters. That now that just takes on a completely different context because, I am virtual in my house, and, I have felt isolation and loneliness the last year. I can't imagine an institution. I can't imagine, those family members that have had, those people with COVID who have had to deal with this disease in an institutional setting without loved ones near them. So I think, yes, I think there are parallels. The main difference with leprosy, of course, is that it is contagious at a certain point. But by the time you have leprosy, chances are that point has come and gone. And so, but yes.
yeah, I've seen people use the metaphor of leprosy and say, they were treated like a leper, and using
Like a
that term.
leper.
And I'm like, well, leprosy is far less contagious than COVID.
Contagious.
COVID is, and less fatal, deadly, all those things. So it's problematic to use that as a metaphor for that.
Right. And it is because, it's, in the last year, and certainly in doing the research for the book, I did look at quote unquote leper colonies in other countries. And while officially they have all closed, I mean, officially leprosariums, that there's kind of no need. The reality is that there are, I think it's over 1,000 still in existence, but so many of these places have to exist because frankly, the society in which they live, these patients would not be cared for. They would not be treated well by family. They would not be treated well by other people. And so I think leprosy and any disease is a constant reminder of how we have to do better for people and their health. We have to consider health a system and improve that system.
Laura, you had a question?
Yes. Want to say hello first.
Hey, Laura.
Long time since I've seen you.
Yes.
Good to see you. Do you know how many people were at Carville at one time or over time?
It has been a few years since I looked at that number, but I believe over the 100 years that it was open, basically, I don't think there were ever, I think it was like a total number of maybe 5,000 or so. It was not a large number. There may be no more than 400 or 500 patients at a time. There may have been a few years where that number was more, that number was less. 95% of the population is immune to the disease or has some kind of immunity. So when you're dealing with leprosy, those patients that were visible enough to have been diagnosed, chances are had, like in the case of my family, if I just use them as my example, 4 of my relatives, you would have never known they had leprosy without their diagnosis. They had other illnesses, but visibly, there was really little you would have seen of the disease. Only one of my relatives had, I guess more stereotypical, she had ulcers and things on her face, and from the surgeries that she had became very much disfigured. But the disease, for the most part, people have the disease and they may not even know they have it. So when you're dealing, I do know, and I can say that, here in Texas, I think there's only been in the last several years, I think a total of like 3 cases. I mean, it's a small number of people. And of course, now it's treated as an outpatient.
One more question is it uncommon to have that many family members to have the disease?
So, at Carville, it was not terribly unusual to find relatives. In fact, one of the sources for my book, she's mentioned in my notes several times for several different poems. She was actually at Carville. So she was diagnosed with leprosy, sent to Carville. And when she got to Carville, she realized her older sister was there. No one in the family had ever told her.
Wow.
Sister had it. And I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't claim to understand all of the medical reasons why that is, but I will say that in my own family's case, they had to have gotten the disease much earlier in their lives. I know for a fact that while my great-grandfather was diagnosed in 1924, the sore he had that ultimately was diagnosed or was the cause for being tested for the disease. The sore that he had prior to going into World War I. The only difference is in World War I, they just needed soldiers, so they weren't going to look too closely at anyone's sore. And so he gets passed into he gets passed for war. And then 5 years later, that same sore is diagnosed, or is the reason for the diagnosis. So they all had the disease much earlier, but they did not, really show symptoms or anything until much later.
I could
And
say that genetic susceptibility seems to run in families, but it's not passed down like mother to child, but the susceptibility is
so,
just like a gene factor.
So yes, that is true.
And then, like you said, the incubation period. I'm not a medical doctor either, but I focused on it through anthropology. But it can be as long as 20 years, like from the time of getting it and then having the first symptoms appear. It could be as short as a couple of years, but it could be much longer too.
Did anybody see that episode of House way back in the day where a father and son had leprosy, but the son's was very quick moving and the father's took like years and years and years, and they thought it was tendinitis? I still remember that. So you're talking about this. I'm like, there was a house about that. It's a great episode.
I will say one more thing about Corville, though, that we have much of what we know about diabetes is actually in thanks to the leprosarium, because the leprosarium became a research facility ultimately, which is frankly what it was created to be. There wasn't much research there until later in its history. But much of what we know about diabetes, we know because of the patients, because so many patients there had diabetes. And so when we see some of those disfigurements, for instance, leprosy itself doesn't necessarily cause you to be disfigured, but some of those disfigurements are the fact that they had other infections that wouldn't heal. And so from diabetes, those infections wouldn't heal. And so they'd have other things. So yes, it's fascinating.
Any last questions or comments for Chris? Okay, well, Chris, anything you want to end on?
Thank you all for joining tonight. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. If you don't have Chris's book yet, we do have copies in the shop. I dropped a link in the chat box. Go online, napabookmine.com, and we can ship as well. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate you joining us, and thank you so much to Chris for joining us as well. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Have a good one.